Okay, so I hope you read the textbook on Zionism, and then I want to clarify a few things on this topic. This is a very sensitive topic, and mainly because it gets super muddled with so much of what's going on currently in politics. Kind of like the term socialism and communism and fascism, Zionism is one of those topics that if you say that word at a party, people either don't care or get their fists up, ready to decide like what side you're standing on, and what are you what's gonna come out of your mouth when if you mention if you say the term Zionist or Zionism. Now, there's something that everybody should keep in mind. So I'm going to try to do this as briefly as possible, but I want to do it as nuanced as possible. In other words, I want to talk about right now, like, I'm not going to say my position on the Israel-Palestine conflict, or we don't need to go into that yet. What we want to do is have an accurate understanding of this concept, and I'm going to tell you about the way that it's articulated from the side of those who are self-proclaimed Zionists, but then I will address how Zionism is viewed by specifically Palestinians, and that has to be brought up in this context, and I'll explain why in a second. So, one thing that you have to always keep in mind, white nationalists in particular talk about Zionism and Zionists, and they're not referring strictly to the Middle East conflict, and in fact, it really has little to do with that. There was a book called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a forgery. Most historians are very clear about that. It's used to create this idea that Jews are the puppet masters of the world. And so when you talk about Zionists in government, they're referring to puppet masters of that government. And it's a kind of idea that Jews rule the world, and a government is not acting on its own nationalist interests, but it's being manipulated by this foreign entity that must be dealt with. That is how it's used by a lot of people. Where it gets confusing is that in the United States, the Israeli lobby is a very powerful lobby. That's just a fact. It's a fact regardless of what you think that's positive or negative. And being a Zionist and supporting Zionism in, let's say, the United States government, I'm not talking about every government in the world, is a very powerful influence on the politics in the Middle East, in the same way that Cuban exiles in Florida have a tremendous influence of lobbying about their position, the U.S. position on Cuba. The Israeli Zionist lobby has a very heavy influence on the policy of the United States towards Israel. This is a factual, just objective point of view. And some in the Jewish community that actually claim to be Zionists have created a group to try to counterbalance AIPAC, the Israeli lobby. They called themselves J Street. I'm not sure where they're at in terms of their influence or their momentum right now. But they have tried to counterbalance what they can see to be too much of a negative influence on American politics, and a kind of support of Israel, right or wrong. I mean, it's kind of like, I think I'm oversimplifying the views of J Street. You could look into that on the internet and see for yourself. Okay, so, but again, I haven't got to where we need to go, which is, what is Zionism and where does it come from? So Zion biblically is Jerusalem, and many Jews will argue that the Jewish religion has always been religiously Zionist, meaning there's always been a talk about next year in Jerusalem, or that the Jews would go back to the Holy Land. That ever since the first century, so this story goes, all Jews were expelled from the Holy Land, and the idea that they're in a diasporic condition, that they are galut, that they're out of where they should be, and that eventually they're supposed to return and create the state of Israel. That was the traditional religious Zionist idea. Although I don't really know if they called themselves religious Zionists. That was just simply Judaism, right? Okay. Now in the 19th century, you'll already, if you got a chance to take a look at this, you would see that as societies were changing, Jews as a minority in Christian Europe, and by the way, they were one of the few, if not only, minorities that were allowed to exist in terms of religion. Okay, so paganism was wiped out of Europe deliberately, but the Christians, originally with a concept called doctrine of witness by the Catholic Church, was the idea that Jews in a humiliated state and condition, being subjugated to Christianity, was a testimony to the supremacy of Christianity and the fact that they rejected Jesus as the chosen one that they should have accepted, and that that they'll be allowed within the Christian world, but in a humiliated state and in a marginalized state, which ultimately it's a doctrine of witness to God transferring his blessings to Christianity. Islam does something different on this, and I'm going to skip over that for right now. So we can see that this is in our modern sensibility of a society that everybody's supposed to be equal and that you don't use religion to discriminate against people. Obviously, this was a bad thing, and this is the kind of the origins of this of anti-Semitism, which was really anti-Judaism. And then there became this idea, as Jewish people were trying to integrate into Europe, there slowly becomes an idea that more or less that Jews are an ethnicity and that they're immutable. Now, by the way, I'm skipping over a lot of things and I'm oversimplifying a lot of things. I'm hoping that this is correct enough and helpful enough. Okay, so in other words, even many Jewish people who were leaving Judaism and converting to Christianity were often still being called Jews, and that kind of issue still happens to this day, which is something that we could think about and talk about another time. And so many Jews were also trying to just assimilate. And there was a man named Theodor Herzl. Now he's in the textbook that you're seeing, a 19th century Viennese Jewish man. He was very secular. He knew almost nothing about Judaism. That is something that almost every expert, rabbis, scholars, there's no controversy, there's no debate about this. Herzl was a secular, non-religious Jewish man that viewed assimilation as the answer to the problems of Jewish life. Now, what ends up happening is this event. It's called the Dreyfus Affair, or the Dreyfus Affair. You can look that up, and it was somewhat like as controversial as, let's say, a Trayvon Martin case or George Floyd. Very polarizing, because what happened in French society, French people were supposed to be the most accepting of Jews. A French military man who's of Jewish background gets accused of treason. By the way, later on it'll be proven that it was a setup, that he wasn't even a treasonous person. But all of a sudden the discourse in France became mobs calling death to the Jews. All of a sudden this was a Jewish problem. So let's say that this man was a traitor. I mean, the fact that he had a Jewish background, what would that have to do with it, and what would that have to do with the community of the Jews? But Herzl saw that even in a society that was supposed to be viewed as the most tolerant, that was that ultimately, when it came down to it, all of a sudden anti-Jewish hatred could just blow up at any moment. And he says, forget it. It's clear that no matter what we do as Jews in Europe, we can't survive here. We have to do something else for ourselves. And ultimately, not just him, but he's really considered kind of like the Karl Marx of Zionism, in the sense of the main guy who gets this idea going. He basically says, look, and this is where I'm going to say that some people would disagree, but I think that this is very well documented, and this is something that you could research. He basically buys into the European romantic nationalist idea instead of resisting it. He says, okay, I get it. There's this trend in Europe at the time, and we've been covering romantic nationalism. Sweden is a place for Swedes, right? Germany is a place for Germans. and we start getting this idea that there's linguistic groups and ethnic groups that have an organic relationship to a certain environment. And people call gypsies, but prefer to call themselves Roma, and Jews, for example, as minority groups that don't have a country, they were always seen as basically parasites, or they're not fitting into this nationalist organic picture. And what he was basically saying is, okay, if Europe agrees that every ethnic group belongs to a particular space, and we Jews don't belong to that space, where would a Jewish person go? Here's one thing that everybody agrees with, the Jews and the Christians, is Jews belong to the Holy Land. Everybody knows that the Bible is a nationalist. I mean, I'm paraphrasing him, okay? But the Bible ends up being not a religious text, but seen as a nationalist text to justify the historic relationship of Jews to what was then called Palestine and a part of the Ottoman Empire. It was a majority Arab, majority Muslim country. Not a country. It was a province of the Ottoman Empire. Majority Arabs, Muslim, then a smaller group of Arabic-speaking Christians, of Greek Orthodox, Catholic, and other branches of Christian faiths. They had Druze, which are a branch of Shiite Islam, kind of like the Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses of Islam, kind of viewed as so different that Muslims don't usually claim them as Muslims, but they do come out of that tradition. A lot of people don't know about the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E. And then a very small portion of religious Jews that always would go there to worship, and a very small portion of Samaritans, which, I mean, that's a whole other topic, but you can look them up. They still exist, very small community. So that's essentially who you had there at the time. And the Zionists had the idea that they should, I mean, here's what's also was common at the time: colonialism. Now, so in other words, Zionists started to say, okay, we Jews belong to, we should have our own state. We should go where everybody agrees that we have originally been, and that is in the Holy Land, which is now Palestine mainly, and parts of Syria, and I believe even parts of Lebanon. And we should do it through the European mode of doing these things, and that is colonialism. Now, there have been Zionist writers, there have been pro-Israel writers that say that to say that Zionism and colonialism come together is a false critique. I just want to make this very clear. You can read the primary text, and so I want to encourage everyone, because almost nobody reads the original Zionist texts. That would be Herzl's State and Revolution. That would be his memoirs, his writings, his short novella called Old Newland, Alt-Neuland, where he had his utopian vision of what it would look like if Jews actually took over Palestine, and at the time that wasn't, didn't actually happen. If you looked at Moses Hess, so I have here, he was a proto-Zionist, and if you look at his writings, a lot, and Herzl said, hey, he wrote about, what we're doing, he already wrote about. This is a lesser known work, but all of these 19th century Jews they used the word colonization, they used the word colonialism, and even imperialism at times. They knew that they needed European help to get Jews to return to this land. And that wasn't controversial at the time from the political left or right at that point. European colonialism was basically just seen as a natural way to do things. Now, why do we have any conflict with this? Well, I think that we can all see how the local population would react to this, right? So I don't have time to go over the exact origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict, but here's what I want to clarify for this point. Zionism basically is Jewish nationalism, and you could actually call it romantic nationalism in the sense that it's the idea that Jews have an organic relationship with the land. even if they've been gone for 2,000 years. And what that means for the Palestinians is no matter how long they've been there, they don't really belong. Which, in a sense, is kind of how Jews were treated in Europe, by the argument that because even if their community has lived in the Rhineland for centuries, they were never going to be a part of it fully. So essentially, that is what tensions were going to arise. Now, the religious community initially was very split on this, because many of the religious Jews might be called religious Zionists, but they felt that God had to intervene, that God punished Jews to go into exile, and that they should not create a state at the locals' expense, because that's usurping God's arrangement. God will only allow for Israel to be created when the Mashiach comes. That's the Messiah, who Christians believe is Jesus, right? And Muslims also believe that Jesus was the Messiah too, by the way. Anyhow, but eventually, as Zionists actually win, and I'm not going to go through all that history now, but the Zionists actually mobilize and are able to make a state happen. Many religious Zionists started to think that maybe God was using the secular atheist Zionists, and many of the Zionists were atheists, by the way, saw them as maybe tools used by God. And so when Israel gets created, for Jews, whether they're religious or not religious, this is the answer to the long history of anti-Semitism in Europe, of what they dealt with as a minority status in even like Muslim countries, although their relationship in Muslim countries is different, which is I don't have time to talk about fully right now. And they definitely saw, especially after World War II and the Holocaust, come on now, we obviously deserve this. This is how they articulate. But for the Palestinians, they've been there for centuries. They saw this land as their land. And as the Ottoman Empire fell, they expected that they would get a nation state just like every other newly formed nation states that were coming out of the fall of empires from Europe to the Ottoman Empire. And so for Jews coming from Europe saying that they're returning and that they belong there more than the population that was there already, this obviously, I mean, I think that if we're going to be fair, it's understandable that the Palestinian population, okay, whether they had their own country, okay, there wasn't a nation state of Palestine with a flag at this point, but there was the people there, and they were also expecting to get one. And then they came up against this. So what you end up really having is, and this is where I'm going to stop right here, the Israel-Palestine conflict is a modern conflict, and it's not based on religion, although religion complicates things. But if you make everybody atheists, and there's already a lot that are in that region, you're still going to have the same problem. And it is what happens, it's why war happens anywhere in the world. It's a conflict of nationalism. It's a conflict of the idea of what does it mean, how does one group get to justify living on land at the expense of somebody else? What is the criteria for me to say I'm more worthy to live in a particular place as opposed to somebody else, right? So this is what I want you to think about in this. And I will leave it there, but that is the Zionism. And so basically, I just actually to clarify, people now who are calling themselves Zionists are basically still saying Israel has a right to exist and that Jews have a right to exist there more than Palestinians. Now, some will still believe that Palestinians can exist as a minority, but they're still saying it's defined. Israel is not defined as an Israeli state. It's defined as a Jewish state. And that's pointed out by an Israeli historian. And so there are some Israelis that call themselves post-Zionists, meaning they don't believe in getting rid of the state of Israel, but they want it to be defined as an Israeli state so that everybody who exists in their country, even if they're not Jewish, could say it's their state. Now, look, again, I'm not getting involved in, we're not going to touch on all this. I wanted you to get an idea of how to conceptualize what we're talking about and what this ideology is and where it came from. So I hope this was helpful, and I realize it went longer than I wanted to, but that's it. Okay. Feel free to write me any questions about this and clarifications.